Good day, and welcome to our second session in the Think Big Virtual Forum. My name is Peter Henderson from Reuters News, and I'm your moderator. Think Big focuses on the topic of a cleaner, greener recovery from COVID-19. The 6 sessions will explore how impact assessment can contribute to a more sustainable future, incorporating climate change and ecocentric perspectives into the economic recovery. It's co-hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment and the Earth Law Center. Today's session will be centered around the theme of COVID-19 impacts on impact assessment. And our first speaker will be Dr. Andreea Nita. Andreea is a senior researcher at the Center for Environmental Research and Impact Studies at the University of Bucharest in Romania. She'll examine how the pandemic affected impact assessment procedures from the researcher's perspective, and she'll also describe the role of stakeholders in the approval of IAIA proposed projects. Let's listen.
Hi everyone, today I'm going to present some results of our projects regarding researchers' perspective on main benefits and issues of IAIA procedure and hidden links between COVID-19 pandemics and the environmental impact assessment procedure. My name is Andreea Nita, and today I'm going to briefly introduce you the project that we are implementing. I will make the introduction of the main problems of the IAIA implementation. I will present the methodology of the study, show you the main results, and make some final recommendation to improve IAIA procedure. The project we are implementing is called Benefits and Constraints of Joint Decision-Making in Romania, from Public Participation to Collaborative Environmental Impact Assessment. And its main scope is to develop a novel framework for increasing the effectiveness and accuracy of this procedure. We are trying to explore the interplay between actors and try to provide practical solutions for a proper collaboration for sustainable development. Mainly, we are trying to integrate network analysis theory in this procedure to improve environmental assessments and collaboration. Although the core IAIA procedures can be compared worldwide, the implementation quality varies from country to country and sometimes from project to project. However, several issues obstructing the proper implementation of the IAIA process are common in developing countries. Low quality of assessment reports, lack of public participation, insufficient equipment and trained staff, inadequate institutional framework for decision-making, no follow-up, or low cooperation between policymakers, researchers, and stakeholders. So, at global level, people's lives have changed with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, leading to a change in the way people carry out their usual day-to-day activities. So very quickly we have transitioned an astonishing number of activities from physical spaces to virtual ones. This has impacted many aspects of the society, including our efforts to achieve sustainability or how we practice mandatory assessments such as environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment and so on. Other changes are less visible, such as low public participation in decision-making, procedures critical to the success of such processes. We reviewed the research papers published, having the following research questions in mind. Is it possible that the environmental benefits emphasized by the research community as an outcome of the coronavirus outbreak and worldwide lockdowns to shape a new way of addressing environmental impact? Would the new post-COVID approaches inflict some changes over the environmental impact assessment procedure? The results of this presentation are part of the second work package of the project, and through this we are trying to establish the main benefits and issues of the EIA perspective. By surveying international researchers, we aim to provide the field with important recommendations for the procedure, for the scientific field, and of course to improve the quality of the environment. Through the complex EIA implementation challenges, there were also often mentioned the limited scientific evidence in the impact assessment studies and low involvement of scientists in policy making and in the implementation of EIA, and of course in the decision making process. In this study, we are investigating researchers' perspective on EIA practice and implementation, considering their expertise in order to fill the gap in understanding the level from which we must start at the international level to adapt the procedure in the context of current and future perspective and environmental issues, especially considering the climate change and COVID context. So for our analysis, we used two databases, one with the 103 responses received from the researchers, and one with the articles obtained from Scopus database using this search algorithm, where we obtained a final data set of 146 articles published in 2020. As data investigation methodology, we apply metrics for the keywords network resulted, like co-occurrence and density network. All the figures were performed using the R program, VOS viewer, and using the bibliometrics R package. As you can see in figure 3, half of the surveyed researchers considered the environmental impact assessment procedure ineffective, indicating a wide range of flaws that prevent the assessment process from being objective and fulfill the legal requirements. Researchers who evaluated the procedure as effective indicated as positive aspects the contribution to sustainable development and the potential to stop the projects that might have a significant negative impact on the environmental components. Figure 4 illustrates the agreement of the researchers regarding the EIA benefits and highlights the fact that most of the researchers agree and strongly agree that the procedure contributes to decision making and brings positive contribution to achieve sustainability, improves the design of projects, offers good opportunities for public involvement in decision making, and the public opinion is considered when making a decision. In contrast, the researchers considered that the procedure fails to integrate well both environmental and social aspects of projects, does not stop projects that produce environmental damages, and does not facilitate an adequate connection between recommendation on mitigation and monitoring and project implementation. The vast majority of researchers agree and strongly agree with the following shortcomings of the impact assessment procedure. Namely, it is limited by technical and managerial capacity in many countries. The quality of the reports is not always considered in decision making. In many environmental impact assessment reports, the methods used to predict impacts are often inadequate or simplistic, and the interpretation are usually subjective. Decision making lacks in terms of consistency for similar projects. Some major decisions are being made even before the procedure is completed. We also created a scenario gathering all responses regarding a perfect network of actors involved in this process, considering, of course, their involvement in each stage. The results of the network analysis showed the fact that the respondents highlight the need for a very close collaboration of the most important actors as follows. More implication of stakeholders, indigenous people and NGOs in stages such as public consultation, decision-making and monitoring, while in stages as assessment and evaluation of impacts or EIA reporting and review, the need of implication of actors such as EIA scholars, assigned expert panelists, independent research community, and external experts chosen by the public. These results were already published in a paper within Environmental Impact Assessment Review Journal, and we invite you to consult the online paper. Figure 7 illustrates the clustered keyword co-occurrence visualization from the beginning of the pandemic. Most of the keywords are related with medical terms, but from the environmental perspective, the analyzed studies focused on topics such as air pollution, environmental impact assessments, air quality, environmental monitoring, and so on. There were different research approaches since the outbreak, such as the impact of the pandemic on air quality due to the halted industrial activities, the impact on household waste flows, diversions and reuse, the impact on the protected areas as a space for disease adaptation, the wastewater state of knowledge and research need, or lack of proper public participation in planning and environmental impact assessment. Figure 8 illustrates the hotspot cluster density analysis, namely the key issues or points to be improved when discussing the effects generated by COVID-19 related to environmental aspects. Considering the occurrence of keywords in the top of the analyzed articles, we found words related to the medical names of the virus, such as pandemic, COVID-19, coronavirus, and so on, followed by specific environmental terms such as human, air pollution, environmental impact assessment, environmental impacts, public health, air quality, environmental monitoring, health risk, urban area health impact assessment. So the hotspot and density cluster analysis revealed that one of the hottest research topics among the analyzed publications was related with air quality during the outbreak and lockdowns. Recent studies highlighted how the restrictions have had a positive impact over air quality, especially in major urbanized areas. Researchers have indicated that when the flow of goods is restricted, the public's concern on reusing and recycling increases, the results of this behavior meaning less overall waste. However, the air quality issue has the potential to set a new bar within EIA procedures by constraining project developers to use newer, non-polluting technologies. From this point of view, the waste reduction issue is more delicate and requires more legal input rather than changes of the consumption patterns. The outbreak exposed the flaws and inefficiency of the consumerist society, but at the same time, the global economy relies on this type of society, and the sudden shift may determine a global recession with critical social impacts. This issue brings into the spotlight the discussion about merging the environmental and social impact assessment with health risk reduction. While the pandemic is still far from being over, and the post-pandemic years will be marked by a high reluctancy towards public gatherings due to health safety issues, public participation in the decision-making process will be at risk. So, as main recommendations to EIA procedure, we mention stronger stakeholders consultation that ensures adequate public participation at the early phases of the process, namely in stages such as scoping, framing the questions, and so on. Stronger implementation and enforcement of mitigation measures. Better collaboration between EIA stakeholders. Methodological approach supported on expert technical knowledge for the screening and scoping stages, which would also orient the revision criteria for the report review, decision-making, and follow-up. One of the most important recommendation would be EIA education promotion. Use of previous EIA case studies to inform future projects and decision-making. Integration of principles such as nature-based solutions in EIA. Adapt EIA to climate change and current health risks. Our findings capture researchers' perspective and could help to change our current traditional approaches. Our results could also help us rethink the environmental impact assessment collaborative process, leading it towards more sustainable holistic planning by learning from past experiences, best practices, and expert opinion. We highlight important EIA researchers' recommendations for improving the procedure and especially the relationship between the procedure and the scientific field. And we are envisaging improving the quality of the environment and for developing a better EIA strategy. Lack of proper public participation in planning was yet another consequence of the COVID pandemic. So the stakeholders and institutions were being for the first time in front of such a situation regarding the stage of EIA public consultation. Considering COVID restrictions, public participation in the decision-making process is at risk, along with a number of conflicts that may arise. Thus, this procedure taking place during and after the pandemic have to consider proper solutions to innovate and improve the stage of public participation issues along the process. Best practices from different countries ensuring public participation within the process without any form of segregation should be introduced as standard approaches for the future, which will raise the quality of impact assessments. Otherwise, neglecting the public's input within procedures such as environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental assessment would lead to a lack of transparency, making these types of procedure only legislative and only on paper without having direct utility in order to minimize the impact of project on the environment, which will have serious consequences if projects with significant negative impact are not stopped in time. Once more, I would like to invite you to check our online paper entitled Researchers' Perspective on the Main Strengths and Weaknesses of Environmental Impact Assessment Procedures, published in the Environmental Impact Assessment Review journal. This paper was written with Professor Stacy Finneran and Professor Laurențiu Rozilovici. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and of course I will be very happy to answer to any questions regarding our work or to cooperate in future projects. You can write me using this email address that you can see on this slide. Thank you. Bye. Enjoy the virtual forum.
Thank you, Andrea. Our second and final speaker of the session is Sumia Mohammed. Sumia is a program assistant at the Ohio Water Resources Center at Ohio State University. She has studies at both OSU and Omdurman Aliyah University in Sudan. She's also a member of the Sudanese Environmentalists Association. Sumia will share case studies in the Sudan and in the Nile that will exemplify comparative impact assessment and its implications for sustainability.
Hello everyone, my name is Sumia Mohammed. I'm a representative of the Sudanese Environmentalists Association in the US office. My presentation will be about Sudan, one of the least developed countries that located in Northeast Africa and one of the Eastern Nile Basin country. It is a country in transition that is facing multiple crises, ranging across economic, political, health, and environmental issues. The Sudan exposed to the ongoing devastating flooding of the last 100 years that has caused significant damage to many sectors, including agriculture, land, crops, livestock, and forestry. The results of my study found that climate change consequences, COVID-19 pandemic, and the ongoing flooding has further weakened the agricultural sector, which is the primary source of livelihoods for a large majority of the population, particularly the most vulnerable. And this is likely to continue to cripple more livelihood assets within the country if no sustainable and preventive measures are implemented. This is what I will explain and discuss in details in the upcoming slides. The Eastern Nile Basin is a region that covers much of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and as the name implies, drains the eastern part of the Nile River watershed. More than 60% of the annual discharge of the Nile River comes from the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile is a highly variable river, and this, as we will see, creates many water management challenges for Sudan. Over 150 million people live in the Eastern Nile Basin, and the vast majority of them sustain their livelihoods through the vital ecosystem services which the Nile River provides. However, we have a big problem. As we will see, it has been projected that climate change will heavily impact this region of Sudan. In addition, some of the livelihood groups in this region are more vulnerable to the projected impacts of climate change than others. The degree of vulnerability for each livelihood group depends on where they live within the basin and their capacity to successfully cope with the various hazards that climate change is creating. That is the subject of this presentation. This study wishes to consider the linkages between human vulnerability and climate change impact within the Eastern Nile Basin of Sudan, followed by a discussion of possible think big vision that could reduce human vulnerability, which we have initially identified using the mixed method research design, including both quantitative and qualitative data. So why did we choose Sudan's Blue Nile Basin as a study area? And why is it important? First of all, Sudan occupies a central location in the Eastern Nile Basin and has been an area of conflict for many years. Second, Sudan has been identified as one of the world's most vulnerable countries to climate change because of the extreme range of impacts it is expected to experience. In Sudan's Blue Nile Basin, the steadily increasing temperature and unpredictable rainfall patterns are already worsening existing vulnerabilities. To demonstrate this, we will take a look at the deadly floods that occurred in 2020. And as we will see, the already untenable situation in Sudan is aggravated by several other stressors that add to the severity of impact at multiple levels. The list is long, but here I will highlight two of the most important issues Sudan is currently experiencing. One is the lack of political stability. Sudan is currently administered by a transitional government which was formed in August 2019. Unfortunately, so far no Ministry of Environment has been created under the transitional government. The second issue is the Ethiopian refugee crisis, which is impacting our study area. The UN Refugee Agency is warning that full-scale humanitarian crisis is unfolding as thousands of refugees flee ongoing fighting in Ethiopian Tigray region. Now let us back up a minute and learn just a little about the history of Sudan as it relates to this study. Sudan is home to one of the world's oldest civilizations. What we now call Northern Sudan was in ancient times known as the Kingdom of Kush, which was the land of the Nubian people. The Kingdom of Kush was a very powerful nation and had particular importance in the region because of the rich soil of the Nile River floodplains and rich deposits of gold and iron ore. Also, a major trade route followed the Nile River, connecting Africa with the countries of the Mediterranean region, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Now let us consider Sudan as a country of mosaic variation, meaning Sudan supports an incredible variety of ecological zones, climate zones, and ethnic groups. For example, there are 5 ecological zones in Sudan: the desert, semi-desert, dry region, semi-dry regions, and the semi-humid. In 1898, Great Britain ruled Sudan in conjunction with Egypt. It was known as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. British rule lasted until 1956 when Sudan gained its independence. During the time of British colonial rule, the first Nile Waters Treaty was signed in 1929. This treaty was only between Great Britain and Egypt. The Sudanese people were not included in the negotiations. The Second Nile Waters Treaty was signed in 1959. This time Egypt and a now independent Sudan signed a bilateral water sharing agreement. The agreement effectively reinforced the provisions of the 1929 treaty but increased the water allocations for both Egypt and Sudan. It is very important to note that both water treaties did not make specific allowance for the water needs of Ethiopia, whose highlands supply more than 80% of the water that makes up the main Nile River. As you can see from this map, the Blue Nile Basin watershed is transboundary, meaning the watershed is shared between Ethiopia and Sudan. The source of the Blue Nile is generated from Lake Tana inside Ethiopia and runs 900 kilometers down through the Ethiopian highlands into Sudan. After that, the Blue Nile continues on and joins with the White Nile at the Nile confluence in Khartoum to form the main Nile as I mentioned previously. Within the study area, it's outlined in black on the map, there are 2 dams. The Sinnar Dam, marked on the map as a black triangle, and the red triangle indicates the location of the Rosaires Dam. Both are very old dams and have not been properly maintained. However, they are still operational. Their main purpose is to supply irrigation water for the national government's large-scale agricultural projects. And finally, and very importantly, the massive Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is marked by the green triangle on the map. This dam, you may have read about it in the news because it's highly controversial. It will likely play an important role in how water is managed within the Blue Nile Basin in the near future. In fact, climate change effects are already being felt, as extreme precipitation events in September 2020 led to catastrophic flooding within the study area, leading to the loss of life and large-scale human displacement due to massive destruction, including damage to homes, crops, and infrastructure. This drone footage captures the severity of the deadly floods in Khartoum, Sudan, the northern part of the Blue Nile Basin. This severity of flooding has not been experienced in over 100 years, which beats records set in 1946 and 1988. According to that, the transitional government of Sudan declared a 3-month national state of emergency on September 4, 2020. That is to say, the basin faces an array of societal challenges that might require specific interventions in order to increase resiliency in the face of climate change and its consequences. To address societal challenges, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, introduced nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are intended to support society's development goals and protect human well-being while enhancing the resilience of ecosystems. Related to nature-based solutions, we look at the vulnerable human livelihood groups within the Blue Nile Basin in light of the effects of climate change, specifically with regards to these catastrophic flooding events. Because the climate change vulnerability is multifaceted, as there is interplaying between socioeconomic and biophysical aspects, it cannot be assessed by taking one ready-made method. Also, because vulnerability is a theoretical concept and cannot be measured directly, therefore there is a need to operationalize this theoretical concept. That is why the study used an integration of two approaches. First, a modified version of the risk-hazard approach equation, which is a top-down approach that focuses on biophysical effects of climate change. The revised equation is impact equal hazard times sensitivity. This equation illustrated the relationship between vulnerability as function of exposure to climatic parameters variability and the internal sensitivity to the Blue Nile Basin systems of these variabilities. Additionally, and to capture a full spectrum of the Blue Nile Basin vulnerability, a political economy approach used to provide descriptive analysis of the identified livelihood groups and vulnerability causes. It is a bottom-up approach that tended to describe why livelihood groups in the study area are sensitive and exposed at the first place to the negative impacts of climate change. Because of the time constraints and the purpose of this presentation, I'm only going to focus on some of the study findings for human livelihoods and ecosystem description and the related current exposure and sensitivity. USAID provided this nice map that includes detailed data about livelihood groups in Sudan. The area with the red circle on the map shows human livelihood zones in the study area. It comprises 3 zones. All of them are dependent on agricultural systems. They are flood retreat cultivation, where people access the Blue Nile floodplains and its fertile soil for cultivation. Central irrigated schemes zone uses the Blue Nile River to feed the canal irrigation system. Southeast rain-fed semi-mechanized agriculture is the biggest of the 3 zones within the basin area and with the largest population. It is a cereal surplus area and depends mainly on rain-fed cultivation. From what we learned in the previous human livelihood and land use slides, explains that the ecosystem in the Blue Nile Basin is a human-dominated ecosystem type of the low rainfall savanna. Low rainfall savannas cover most of the Blue Nile Basin area, with precipitation varying from 300 to 800 millimeters per year, and the region is characterized by a 9-month dry season. The basin is dominated by the vertisol soil, which are clayey and are appropriate for mechanized farming. The central and southern part of the basin comprises the Sahel Belt, where most of Sudan's irrigated and rain-fed agricultural activities are practiced. Besides the dominated croplands, the low rainfall savanna has two different forms of natural vegetation cover: the grasses and the trees. It is dominated by acacia forests. The flood basin areas dominated by Acacia nilotica that are essential regulating ecosystem service that acts as a riparian buffer in flooding season. The study found that both climatic factors combined with humans' activities through cultivation, expansion, and cutting trees, mainly for fuel wood, led to observed decrease of areas covered by acacia forest. The chart on the left provides an overview of the most frequent natural disasters in Sudan. It showed that the number of people affected by the flood events in the country from 1985 to 2015 is the highest, comparing to the other natural disasters, and the occurrence of the flood events are increasing. The pie chart on the top right explains the average annual natural hazard occurrence from 1900 to 2018. It showed that the percentage of flood occurrence is 36% and epidemic is 42%, which are mostly water-related diseases such as cholera and malaria that have increased as a result of flood events. River flooding hazard is classified as high by Think Hazard, meaning that potentially damaging and life-threatening river floods are projected to occur at least once in Sudan in the next 3 years. Lockdown and other prevention measures put in place to prevent COVID-19 spread had an adverse impact on human livelihoods as well as food availability and access in the study area. A set of complex and intersecting factors, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate-induced natural hazards such as 2020 flood disaster, and unpredictable rainfall pattern, have led to a deterioration of crop production and the food security in the study area. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification reported in September 2020 that about 9.6 million people were under a high level of acute food insecurity, and this is the highest classification number recorded for Sudan comparing to the past years. The report stated that the most affected communities are in rural areas that sustain their livelihoods from the ecosystem and its services. It's worth mentioning that food insecurity remains alarming high in all Sudan, especially with high food price hikes exacerbated by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the current political situation after the recent military coup in October 25, 2021. Both reasons compromise livelihood, household purchasing power, and food access of the vulnerable population. Because the flood events rose to the level of a disaster, so all the ecosystem services were compromised. For example, the study found that the regulating services of the Blue Nile riparian forest, particularly Acacia nilotica trees, were being destroyed. Although the Acacia nilotica are the only trees that well adapted to the prolonged flood along these ecosystems. The rainfall rates of the 2020 exceeded normal records as aforementioned, and had significant adverse impact on this ecosystem. These impacts are: the natural range within the riverine forest has been affected by the high rates of flooding. Additionally, high siltation rates, which affect the natural water catchments in these riverine forests. Also, the long flood period will lead to deviation in the forest works plans that will affect the suitable use of the ecosystem resources. On the other hand, agriculture sector losses and impacts were significant from flood. Taking all the, again, 2020 flood events as an example, nearly one-third of cultivated land was flooded, impacting 3 million people in agriculture households. This added to the already severe food access problems in the country. About 9.6 million people faced acute food insecurity in 2020. The study found that the basin faces ecological crisis that is exacerbated by specific societal challenges, particularly climate change, food security, and human health that have adverse impact on vulnerable livelihood groups. With all these societal challenges in the basin, there is a need to work with nature instead of against it. That's why the Sudan government could consider using nature-based solutions to achieve the country's plans for sustainable development. Accordingly, the Think Big vision that I would like to share with you for Sudan at the local level is adopting an emerging form of environmental assessment such as vulnerability and impact assessment process to determine and design the suitable intervention projects. Implementing such form of impact assessment allows decision makers to adopt a holistic approach to implement nature-based solutions to face the societal challenges, especially climate change and its consequences. Additionally, it addresses the linkages between livelihood and ecosystem services to identify appropriate interventions to increase resilience for the vulnerable livelihood groups. Equally important, vulnerability and impact assessment enhance public participation, as it identifies climate change adaptation vision that the vulnerable population themselves have previously developed or planned for, to reduce vulnerability and at the interest of public as well as nature. Other important vision at the regional level and specifically with relation to the flood risk that has been identified in this study, that the Blue Nile Basin being managed using an integrated watershed management approach. Of course, this will need to be conducted in transboundary manner in collaboration with Ethiopia and Egypt because the shared watershed between Ethiopia and Sudan and because Egypt's dependence of the Blue Nile as its main water source. It is strongly recommended that the Eastern Nile Basin countries to change the paradigm by creating a model of the system that allows them to consider the system as a whole and apply a strategic environmental assessment as a comprehensive impact assessment tool for integrated water common resource management. For sure, the implementation for strategic environmental assessment requires serious steps and certain recommendations in institutional and legislative reforms, as well as human capacity building, which means that the three riparian countries on the legal side need to review their environmental laws and regulations and upgrade them to the level of strategic thinking. Thank you for your kind attention. I would be happy to hear from you and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Sumia, for wrapping up today's session. Today's was the second of a 6-session series. The next will be on Tuesday, the 9th of November at the same time. In between sessions, we hope you'll take a look at the online discussion board, which is at thinkbig.iaia.org. It's a good place to leave your thoughts, to ask some questions, and it'll be up until the end of November. So, thanks again for joining us today. We hope to see you next time at Think Big.